talking a lot about diarrhea, just diarrhea all the time, and fevers, lots and lots of fevers.
A friend of mine who cut my hair and who I'd had sex with, and most of my friends had had sex with, got KS and died very suddenly. And that was immediately put into a context of other gay men dying in New York and some articles coming out in the gay press describing that. And it seemed like the ones who died first all had some characteristics in common that I didn't share. And so I felt relatively safe. And I wasn't surprised because I knew that we had been pushing things to the limit with our drug use and our sexuality.
I would hear about people dying a lot, that people were dying more and more, that it was an epidemic, that it was, you know, spreading, that it was, that no one was immune, that it could get everybody, and that you could get sick, you could die from having one exposure. And, you know, all this stuff, all these things that made me feel like there really was no way out.
It seemed like a period of time when I was going to a memorial once a month, a doctor, a priest, a school teacher. But the one common denominator was that, you know, I did know that they were gay.
There's really no contradiction in holding certain groups in contempt, as gays are often horrifically in this culture, and at the same time wanting to read about the nasty things they do. This became big news. And this also was news that could affect everyone else. In other words, you know, they were starting it. These gay men were starting something that came out of the box, and it could spread throughout the culture. Now that was pushed on pretty strongly. Heterosexual AIDS became an issue that led to funding for AIDS research.
I remember reading in the Wall Street Journal in 1996 a May 1st front page article. I couldn't believe it. CDC officials were admitting that even as they were saying everyone's at risk for AIDS, they knew that wasn't true, but they also knew that if Americans realized that, they wouldn't support substantial AIDS funding.
What the journal didn't report was that this was a strategy that had actually been developed 10 years earlier by volunteers from the public relations industry, people with a lot of PR experience who were also gay, who figured that they could serve their community best by mounting a PR campaign, convincing Americans that everyone was or soon would be at risk for AIDS, so that there would be support for a massive program of government funding for this particular condition, far out of line in terms of funding per patient than what's being spent on cancer or heart disease or a lot of other diseases that kill far more people.
The people that say that HIV is not the cause of AIDS are practicing supreme denial. It is amazing how human beings can look at black and call it white, or look at white and call it black. They can look at all this evidence, but if they don't choose to believe it, they don't choose to believe it.
I've been covering AIDS for something like 20 years, and for perhaps half of that time, I reported it from the conventional orthodox perspective that this was a deadly new virus that was causing this condition and spreading secretly among us, putting at risk everybody who was sexually active. In the last few years, I've come across some different points of view which, to begin with, I found very hard to believe or accept, but I found some space in my very busy work schedule at the London Sunday Times in the early 90s, where I was working as medical and science correspondent, to study the references and the viewpoints being put forward by some doctors and scientists, mainly in the States, who had this questioning viewpoint about HIV's role in AIDS. And gradually, to my amazement, I found that the evidence seemed to suggest that they were much closer to the truth than what I'd been reporting previously.
I was an undergraduate biology student at Florida A&M University when I first heard that some people were saying that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. This sounded really crazy to me, but I looked into it, and I found out that the leading critic of the HIV causes AIDS model was a University of California at Berkeley biology professor, Peter Duesberg, who was a pioneer in the study of retroviruses, and HIV is a retrovirus. Duesberg was the first scientist to isolate the genetic structure of a retrovirus, and this was a discovery that several of my textbooks had described. I read some of his papers. They were very fascinating, they were very clear, and they made sense to me.
The basic assumption that AIDS was infectious has never been, in fact, tested, never been discussed, never been contested, or never been proved. That is an assumption that is very popular among doctors and scientists who study microbes and viruses, which are the bulk of doctors these days, or scientists in microbiology. But the majority of diseases affecting us in the Western world, that is over 99% of them, are not caused by viruses and microbes. But all doctors are all too happy to blame any disease or any new variant of a disease on a microbe, because then they know what to do, what to look for, and how to possibly cope with it by making vaccines and antimicrobial and antibiotic drugs. We are now indicting the most harmless and most difficult to detect viruses with technology that is designed to find a needle in a haystack and blame them for fatal diseases under conditions where they are virtually undetectable in a patient, like HIV and AIDS. And that's the trouble with the hypothesis. We are blaming a virus that is practically not there, only antibodies against it are there, that is biochemically not active, that is not infecting more than 1 in 1,000 of T cells in an AIDS patient for fatal immune deficiency. If that were a cause of death, none of us would be speaking here today. We would all be in cemeteries or in intensive care units.
Dr. Kary Mullis, who invented the polymerase chain reaction, gives this in '83, I believe, and he got the Nobel Prize in 1993, gives this little story that he was hired to do PCR for an HIV project for a private company, and he wrote as the first sentence of his paper, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And he said he turned to a virologist and said, what's the reference for that? And the virologist said, you don't need it. Well, Mullis is smart enough to know, of course, something new as this, you'd always have a series of original papers that established unequivocally that this was the cause of AIDS.
Then, and only then, I started looking into it. I looked up a bunch of papers in Science that Bob Gallo, I knew about him and had written. I figured, well, Gallo must have been the one to figure it out, because he's the name I've heard associated with it. And I looked at his papers, and I didn't find anything in there that actually showed me that there was a fact now in science called HIV is the cause of AIDS, or even the probable cause of AIDS, which is all I would have expected, the probable cause of AIDS. Highly probable, because they were attacking the whole problem by then as though it were certainly the cause. So I'd expect it to be highly probable, but I couldn't find anything that said it was remotely probable even. It was possible, but it wasn't probable. And so therefore, it wasn't even close to what you'd call a fact.
Well, I call these the AIDS axioms. AIDS is contagious, AIDS is sexually transmitted, AIDS is caused by HIV, and that